The sun of the South African highveld is a cruel entity. It bakes the air, making the barren hills and dry, scorched grasslands seem to shimmer in a silent dance. Underground, deep within the Wonderstone mine near the small town of Ottosdal, the air is no more pleasant. Here, the heat comes not from the sun, but radiates from the very heart of the planet. It is thick, carrying the smell of pyrophyllite dust as fine as powder, the acrid scent of diesel, and the sweat of men hard at work. In this semi-eternal world of headlights and profound darkness, Jan was part of the rhythm. His life was measured by the screech of drills, the roar of excavators, and the deafening blast of dynamite charges. He was familiar with every rock face, every vein of the gray-green pyrophyllite that people often called Wonderstone for its soft, easily workable properties. To Jan, there was nothing wondrous about it. It was just rock, the thing that fed his family, that had etched calluses onto his hands, and that filled his days, one after another. One afternoon in the late 1970s, midway through a shift, a familiar explosion echoed through the tunnels. The dust settled. Jan, leaning against a still warm rock face, squinted at the newly exposed wall. It was a sight he had seen 1,000 times. A jagged, uniform surface of sedimentary rock, formed when the Earth was still a young planet. But today, something was different. It wasn't a shiny streak of ore or a glittering quartz crystal. It was just a small glint, an unusual reflection in the beam of his helmet lamp. Curious, Jan stepped forward. He wiped away the thick layer of dust clinging to the rock surface. The dust fell away, revealing something that made him hold his breath. It was almost perfectly round. A spherical object, about the size of a golf ball, was nestled within the rock, as if it had been there since the dawn of time. It looked nothing like any rock he had ever seen. Its surface was smooth, with a bluish metallic sheen, speckled with tiny white flecks. It didn't look like it had formed with the rock, but rather as if it had been placed within it. Using his geologist's hammer, Jan gently tapped the rock around the object. He worked with a careful patience he didn't know he possessed. He didn't want to damage it. After a few minutes, the object was freed and fell into his gloved palm. It was surprisingly heavy and cool to the touch. He turned it over in his hand, and then he saw them. 3 grooves. They were perfectly etched, running parallel to each other around the sphere's equator. They were not natural cracks. They were too even, too precise, too intentional. They looked as if they had been made by a lathe, by a skilled hand. Jan's mind began to spin. He was a practical man, a man who believed in what he could see and touch. He knew this pyrophyllite rock. The geologists who occasionally visited the mine spoke of it. They said it was formed from volcanic ash that settled at the bottom of a shallow sea a long, long time ago. How long? He couldn't remember the exact number, but it was an unimaginable figure. A number with too many zeros. Billions of years. Before the dinosaurs, before the first trees, before anything more complex than a single-celled bacterium floated in the primordial ocean. So, how could an object that looked manufactured exist in a layer of rock formed before life even had a chance to begin thinking about manufacturing things? Jan tightened his grip on the sphere. The cold of the metal seemed to seep through his glove, into his veins. He looked around the dark tunnel, listening to the echo of water dripping from the rock ceiling. For the first time in his many years working underground, he felt an eerie silence, the silence of deep time. He hadn't found a strange stone. He felt as if he had found a question posed from a past so deep it defied all understanding, a question that could shake the foundations of everything he knew about the world. In the darkness of the earth, an echo from 3 billion years ago was whispering in his palm, and it asked, before there were humans, before there was even life. Who, or what, made this? The question Jan asked himself deep in the mind did not stay there. Like the strange spheres themselves, it was brought to the surface, blinked in the harsh South African sun, and began a journey of its own. Its first destination was a modest building on PC Pelser Street in Klerksdorp, the Klerksdorp Museum. And there, it found its first listener, a man named Rolf Marx. Rolf Marx was not a geologist with prestigious degrees or an archaeologist with experience at famous excavation sites. He was a man of the land, a local historian with a tireless curiosity. His office, which was also the museum, was not a glamorous exhibition space. It was a collection of the soul, filled with fragments of the past. Vortrekker tools, black and white photographs of the early mining days, ammonite fossils found on nearby farms, and an extensive stamp collection. Every item had a story, and Rolf Marx was the storyteller. One morning, the museum door opened, bringing in a few miners, including John. They looked awkward, men accustomed to rock and dynamite, now standing amidst glass cases filled with history. They placed a small box on Marx's desk. "Mr. Marx," Jan began, his voice a little hesitant, "we found this at the mine, in the pyrophyllite layer. We thought, maybe you should see it." Rolf Marx, with his thick glasses and salt and pepper hair, smiled kindly. He was used to local people bringing in their discoveries. Usually, they were oddly shaped rocks or broken pieces of pottery. He opened the box without much expectation, and then he fell silent. Inside the box, on a cloth lining, was the sphere Jan had found. Under the electric light of the office, it looked even stranger. Marx said nothing. He carefully lifted it out. His fingers traced the smooth surface, then paused at the parallel grooves. He rotated it, feeling its almost perfect balance. His eyes, accustomed to looking at the details of the past, were now confronted with something that seemed to come from a past that could not exist. "Where did you say you found it?" Marx asked, his voice low, his eyes never leaving the object. "In the rock face, sir, the oldest layer. We found a few more." Marx looked up, meeting the miner's eyes. He saw in them not the excitement of treasure hunters, but a genuine confusion. The same confusion he was now feeling. This was not a joke. In the following weeks, the Klerksdorp Museum became home to uninvited guests from another era. The miners brought more spheres. They were not all identical. Some were almost perfect spheres, others were flattened ellipsoids, like a squashed rugby ball. Some had a single groove, others had 2 or 3 running in parallel. Some spheres had a shell as hard as steel, but inside was a soft, fibrous material that disintegrated into dust upon contact with air. Rolf Marx began his work. He didn't have a modern laboratory, but he had the meticulousness of a keeper. He took out his instruments, a caliper, a scale, and a thick ledger. For each sphere, he carefully recorded the details: diameter, weight, number of grooves, and a detailed description of its color and texture. He made no attempt to explain them. He simply listened to the story they were telling. He decided to give them a special place. In a carefully lit glass case, next to the familiar fossils, the Klerksdorp Spheres lay, silent and defiant. They immediately became the center of attention. Local people came to see them, marveling at their perfection. They whispered among themselves, were they ancient cannonballs? Or some form of fossilized egg? But the real legend began when the story crossed the borders of Klerksdorp. A local journalist wrote a small article about the mysterious spheres at the museum. That article was picked up by a national magazine. Then, an English tourist, a man with a passion for anomalous phenomena, photographed them and sent the pictures to a publisher in London. Like a chain reaction, Jan's question from the mine was now being multiplied and spread across the globe. The small Klerksdorp Museum began receiving letters from all over, from America, from Germany, from Japan. UFO researchers, ancient astronaut theorists, Amateur archaeologists all wanted to know more about these objects. They called them the Klerksdorp Spheres. To the outside world, they were evidence for the most audacious theories. A high-tech civilization that existed 3 billion years ago. Extraterrestrial visitors to Earth. A history completely different from what we were taught. But to Rolf Marx, the man sitting at the center of this storm of attention, they remained what they were on the day he first saw them, a mystery. He answered the letters politely, providing the information he had recorded. But he never claimed to know the answer. He was just the keeper. He cared for the spheres, cleaned the glass case, and watched the astonished faces of those who came to see them. He knew his role was not to solve the mystery, but to ensure it would not be forgotten. He was preserving the question, waiting for those with the right tools and knowledge to begin seeking an answer. And he knew, sooner or later, they would come. The real scientific investigation had only just begun. The letters and phone calls eventually reached the people Rolf Marx had been waiting for. News of the strange spheres, propagated through paranormal magazines and late-night television shows, had crossed the boundary of mere curiosity and landed on the radar of the scientific community. But their reaction was not one of excitement about a lost civilization. Instead, it was one of professional intrigue, the urge of an investigator faced with a unique geological crime scene. One of the first investigators to enter the scene was Professor Bruce Cairncross, a mineralogist at the University of Johannesburg, formerly Rand Afrikaans University. Cairncross was not a man who sat in an academic ivory tower. He was a field geologist, most comfortable with his hands covered in dust and his eyes fixed on a rock face. To him, stories of ancient astronauts or lost technologies were just background noise. The real, scientific question was far more interesting. What geological process created these objects? Along with colleagues like Paul V. Heinrich, a geologist and researcher from the United States, their investigation did not begin at the glass case in the Klerksdorp Museum. It began where it all started. The Wonderstone Mine. Their journey was a journey back in time. They didn't just look at the extracted spheres, they studied them in their tomb. Under the harsh sun, they walked along the pyrophyllite cliffs, where the cuts of machinery exposed the geological strata-like pages in Earth's history book. They took samples, made notes, and reconfirmed what the miners had vaguely known. This rock layer was unbelievably ancient. Isotopic analysis dated it to approximately 2.8 billion years old. This was an indisputable fact, a starting point that both sides of the debate had to accept. But while conspiracy theorists looked at the 2.8 billion year figure and saw proof of an ancient civilization, Cairncross and Heinrich looked at it and saw a context. They didn't ask who made them, but what happened here 2.8 billion years ago. The answer began to form when they placed the spheres under the lens of geology. The scientific explanation, when revealed, was not a dry dismissal, but a stunningly creative story in itself. It was called concretion formation. To understand this story, we must travel back to an Earth we would not recognize. 2.8 billion years ago, the atmosphere had almost no oxygen. The continents were just beginning to form. The place where the Wonderstone Mine now exists was a shallow sea, a quiet basin. For millions of years, ash from nearby volcanic eruptions slowly settled, forming a fine, dense mud at the bottom of the sea. The story of a Klerksdorp sphere began with something incredibly small, a nucleus. It could have been a grain of sand, a fragment of a single-celled organism's shell, or just a tiny mineral cluster. In the mineral-rich waters of the primordial ocean, this nucleus acted as a chemical magnet. Mineral molecules dissolved in the water, mainly calcite or hematite, began to be drawn towards it. This process did not happen overnight. It was a symphony of time. Layer by layer, mineral crystals slowly precipitated and grew around the nucleus, much like a pearl forms around a grain of sand inside an oyster. Millions of years passed. The layer of volcanic ash mud grew thicker, burying the growing spheres deeper. The immense pressure from the overlying sediments and the heat from the Earth's interior compacted them, turning the soft mud into hard pyrophyllite rock, and turning the precipitated mineral masses into spheres as hard as stone. This was the geologist's eureka moment. When Cairncross held a Klerksdorp sphere in his hand, he didn't see an artificial artifact. He saw a masterpiece of nature, a geological pearl gestated in the Earth's womb for a quarter of the planet's history. This explanation was elegant, consistent with all known geological evidence, and did not require invoking mysterious civilizations. But what about the artificial features? What about those perfect grooves? This is where the scientific investigation became most sophisticated. The geologists argued that the grooves were not carved at all. They were an illusion of the formation process. Imagine the growing concretion inside a non-uniform layer of mud. This mud has many fine layers, some with finer grains, some with coarser ones. As the concretion grows, it pushes these mud layers out around it. The layered structure of the surrounding environment gets imprinted onto the surface of the growing sphere. After billions of years, as the pyrophyllite rock weathers, the finer sedimentary layers, corresponding to the grooves, would erode slightly faster than the rest of the sphere, making the grooves more pronounced. They were not the mark of a lathe, but the mark of the very sediment that gave birth to them. Paul Heinrich pointed out that this phenomenon, known as equatorial grooving, has been observed in concretions all over the world. From the Moqui marbles in Utah to the concretions in Schoharie County, New York. The Klerksdorp spheres were not unique. They were just a particularly striking example. And what of the other astonishing claims? The rumor that they were so perfectly balanced that the California Space Institute had to use NASA technology to find their center of gravity, or that they rotated on their own in the museum display case. The scientists traced the origins of these claims. They found that they did not originate from any peer-reviewed scientific paper. They came primarily from books on paranormal phenomena and conspiracy websites, repeated without any empirical evidence to back them up. No scientist had ever published a study showing these spheres to have any physical properties that defied known laws. For the geological community, the case was closed. The Klerksdorp spheres were a spectacular example of nature's artistry, a testament to how geological processes, given enough time and the right conditions, can produce shapes of such order and symmetry that they can fool the human eye into seeing the hand of intelligence. They had their answer, an answer based on evidence, observation, and a deep understanding of the planet's history. They had placed the spheres back in their rightful place in the grand story of the Earth. But the world is not composed solely of geologists. And for another, growing faction, the explanation of mainstream science was not an enlightenment. It was a cover-up. For them, the real investigation had only just begun. And these spheres were not a geological curiosity. They were Exhibit A in a much larger case, the case of a stolen history. While geologists like Bruce Cairncross and Paul Heinrich were carefully closing the case file, sealing it with rational explanations and peer-reviewed evidence, halfway across the world, another man was opening a completely different file. For him, the explanation of mainstream science was not an end, but a beginning. It was a cover-up, a deliberate evasion of a truth too large, too frightening to be acknowledged. His name was Michael Cremo. Cremo did not work in a brightly lit geology lab or a prestigious university office. His workspace was a world of forgotten documents, dismissed records, and artifacts hidden away in the basements of the most esteemed museums. He was not a geologist or an archaeologist in the traditional sense. He considered himself a researcher of Vedic archaeology, a seeker of evidence for a worldview rooted in ancient Hindu scriptures, that the history of humanity is not a straight evolutionary line from ape to man, but a great, repeating cycle. According to this worldview, anatomically and intellectually modern humans have existed on this planet for millions, even billions, of years. High-tech civilizations have risen and fallen countless times, leaving faint traces that modern science, bound by Darwinian doctrine, has willfully ignored. In the early 1990s, as Cremo and his associate, Richard L. Thompson, were deep in research for their monumental book, Forbidden Archaeology, the story of the Klerksdorp Spheres came to them like a gift from the past. It wasn't just an interesting object. It was a silver bullet. For Michael Cremo, when he looked at a photograph of a Klerksdorp sphere, he did not see a concretion. He saw an impossibility. The geologist's explanation of natural formation was, to him, a forced contrivance, a desperate attempt to fit an anomalous piece of evidence into an already overstuffed theoretical framework. He began to ask the questions he believed mainstream science had deliberately dodged. They say they are concretions. Cremo might have argued in his lectures or interviews, his voice calm but weighty. Very well. But look at them. Look at the symmetry. Look at those grooves. They say it's due to sedimentary layering. But how could that layering accidentally create such a perfect decorative design? Why are they so neatly placed around the equator of the sphere? If this is a common natural process, why don't we find millions of these perfectly grooved spheres all over the world? Why are they concentrated in one location? In a rock layer dated to precisely 2.8 billion years ago. In Cremo's hands, these spheres were no longer stones. They became artifacts, products of technology. He argued that no known natural process could simultaneously produce a near-perfect sphere, a hard metallic surface, and precisely machined grooves. The combination of all these features, he insisted, could only point to one thing: intelligence. His book, Forbidden Archaeology, became a phenomenon upon its publication. It was over 900 pages long, filled with similar cases. Anomalous evidence dismissed by the scientific establishment. The Klerksdorp Spheres were given a place of honor within it. Cremo placed them alongside their other out-of-place brethren. The London Hammer, an iron hammer found embedded in a 140-million-year-old sandstone concretion in Texas. The Baghdad Battery, a set of clay jars containing copper tubes and iron rods, believed to be a form of primitive battery, dated to around 2,000 years ago, centuries before Volta's invention. The Laetoli footprints. Alongside the famous footprints of early hominids, there are other tracks that look identical to those of modern humans, dated to 3.6 million years ago. When placed in this context, the Klerksdorp Spheres were no longer a solitary anomaly. They became part of a pattern, a repeating piece of evidence for a larger truth. For Cremo and his thousands of supporters around the world, the story became clear. 2.8 billion years ago, when textbooks say the Earth was a planet of bacteria, some civilization existed. They had the technology to mine metals, to craft objects with high precision. They left these spheres behind, perhaps as part of a machine, a type of ammunition, or a ritual object whose purpose we can never understand. And then, they disappeared, wiped out by some catastrophe, leaving only these faint echoes in the heart of the stone. Michael Cremo became the challenger, a modern-day Galileo in the eyes of his supporters. He wasn't fighting the church, but what he called the knowledge dictatorship of Darwinian science. He felt the strong resistance from the scientific community, but that only strengthened his conviction. He saw their dismissal not as a sign that he was wrong, but as a sign that he had touched upon something dangerous, a truth that could topple the entire edifice of modern knowledge. His emotion was not anger, but a calm determination. He traveled the world, speaking at conferences, participating in debates, presenting his evidence. He told his audiences, "Don't just believe me. Look at the evidence for yourselves. Ask yourselves why these objects are hidden away in museum basements instead of being displayed in the most prominent positions. Ask yourselves why any scientist who dares to study them seriously is branded a crank." The appeal of his argument was undeniable. It tapped into a deep-seated skepticism in the human psyche towards authority and institutions. It offered the feeling of being let in on a massive secret, a truth that had been deliberately hidden by the gatekeepers of knowledge. The story of the Klerksdorp Spheres, through the lens of Michael Cremo, was no longer a debate about geology. It had become a battle to reclaim history, a crusade against a silent, centuries-long conspiracy. And so, two completely contradictory narratives were formed, both revolving around the small objects found in a South African mine. On one side, a story of slow, unconscious creation by nature, told in the language of science and verifiable evidence. On the other, a story of a glorious lost past and a conspiracy to hide the truth, told in the language of skepticism and a belief in the extraordinary. The stage was set. The characters had taken their places. The final showdown between two worldviews, between two ways of seeing reality, was about to take place in the only venue that could judge them: the court of knowledge and reason. If there were a courtroom for ideas, where evidence is weighed and worldviews clash, the Klerksdorp Spheres would surely be the central exhibit in a trial of the century. In this hypothetical trial, there are no defendants or prosecutors. Only two opposing lines of argument, both fervent, both believing they are defending the truth. On one side stands the scientific establishment, represented by geologists like Bruce Cairncross and Paul Heinrich, whose law book is the Principles of Physics and Verifiable Evidence. On the other side is the camp of forbidden archaeology, with its chief advocate Michael Cremo, who uses the very gaps and anomalies in the record as his weapon. And we, the observers, are the jury. The first piece of evidence is presented: a close-up photograph of a sphere, with its parallel grooves running perfectly around its equator. Michael Cremo steps forward. His voice is not that of a man speculating, but of one presenting an obvious fact. "Look at this," he says, pointing to the photograph. "Look at the precision, the parallelism, the evenness. Nature does not work this way. Nature creates ordered chaos, random veins and cracks. This is order. This is symmetry. This is the mark of a tool, of a machine, of intelligence. They tell us it's due to sedimentary layering, but how could that layering accidentally create such a perfect decorative design? This is not a byproduct of nature. This is a design." It is the geologist's turn to rebut. Bruce Cairncross presents a series of other images. "Ladies and gentlemen," he begins, "these are concretions from Utah, from New York, from Australia. Look, they too have bands, grooves. Perhaps they are not as perfect as some of the finest Klerksdorp specimens, but they show one thing clearly. This phenomenon, which we call equatorial grooving, is a well-documented natural process. Nature, given billions of years and the right conditions, is a great artist. It can create perfectly symmetrical crystals, beautiful six-sided snowflakes. The fact that it creates grooved spheres is not a miracle, but just another testament to its endless creativity. Anomaly does not equal artifice." The next piece of evidence is presented: the age of the rock, 2.8 billion years. Cremo sees this as his trump card. This number, he insists, is what makes their explanation absurd, and our explanation necessary. 2.8 billion years. Mainstream science tells us that at this time, the most complex life on this planet was blue-green algae. And yet, here we have what appear to be machined metallic objects. This doesn't just challenge a minor detail, it overthrows the entire evolutionary tree. It forces us to admit that our history, the history of intelligent life, is far longer and more complex than we are led to believe. This age is the irrefutable proof. Paul Heinrich steps up, armed with a philosophical principle. Occam's razor, simplest explanation is usually the correct one. Mr. Cremo is right about one thing. Heinrich concedes. The 2.8 billion year figure is critically important, but it is the strongest evidence against his hypothesis, not for it. Imagine a high-tech civilization capable of metalwork. What would they leave behind? Not just a few spheres. They would leave traces of mines, smelting plants, cities, industrial waste dumps. They would alter the chemical composition of the sedimentary layers on a massive scale. We have studied these rock layers exhaustively. We have drill cores from all over the world. And what do we find? Nothing. Not a single other trace of such a civilization. Only these spheres, which exist in a geological context that perfectly explains their natural formation. Which explanation is simpler? That a global high-tech civilization existed and vanished without a trace, except for a few dozen spheres? Or that these spheres are simply an interesting geological product? Occam's razor cuts only one way. Finally, the trial turns to the most contentious evidence, the rumors that have turned these spheres into a legend. Cremo, citing articles from magazines like Weekly World News and Personal Reports, makes his final claims. "We have the accounts," he says. "Accounts of these spheres being so perfectly balanced they could spin on a flat surface for minutes. We have reports that they rotate on their own in the museum's display case, defying all laws of physics. We have claims that they are so hard they cannot be scratched, even with steel. These are not stones. These are objects with anomalous properties." Here, the geologists are no longer debating geology. They are debating scientific methodology. "Accounts," Cairncross replies, his voice calm. "That is precisely the problem. They are just accounts. Who performed these balance tests? Where were the results published? In a peer-reviewed scientific journal, or in a tabloid famous for stories about Batboy? Who witnessed them rotating? Is there a video? Was there a study of the micro-vibrations in the museum that could cause such a phenomenon? No. These are anecdotes, repeated until they become fact in the minds of many. Science does not operate on anecdote. It operates on repeatable, verifiable data. Until someone takes one of these spheres into a laboratory, performs rigorous measurements, and publishes results showing they violate the laws of physics, all we have are fascinating stories. The trial draws to a close. Both sides have rested. The jury, which is us, is now faced with a choice. On one side is a consistent narrative, supported by established geological principles and evidence from around the world, but perhaps lacking a certain magic. On the other is a thrilling, inspiring story of a lost past and a conspiracy to hide the truth, but one that relies on anomalous evidence and unverified accounts. From the perspective of science, the verdict is clear. There is no convincing evidence that the Klerksdorp Spheres are anything other than a fascinating natural phenomenon. The case is closed, but in the court of human imagination and curiosity, the jury is still out. Because even if these spheres are a product of nature, they still pose a deeper question. A question not about geology, but about us. The trial is over. From the perspective of the scientific method, the verdict has been delivered. Clearly and decisively. There is no concrete, verifiable evidence to suggest the Klerksdorp Spheres are products of artificial intelligence. Every one of their characteristics, from their spherical shape and hard shell to their controversial grooves, can be plausibly explained by known geological processes. They are concretions, sculptures quietly crafted by nature over billions of years. The case is closed. But if so, why isn't the story over? Why, despite the scientific explanations, do images of these 3-billion-year-old artifacts continue to circulate on the internet, in mystery documentaries, and in late-night conversations? Why do they still hold the power to fascinate and ignite our imagination? The answer no longer lies in the realm of geology, but deep within the human psyche. The Klerksdorp Spheres have transcended their physical nature to become something more. A symbol. They are a Rorschach test made of stone, and what we see in them reflects our deepest hopes, fears, and longings. The first reason for this enduring appeal lies in our own brains. Humans are pattern-seeking machines. From our earliest days, the ability to recognize patterns in nature, the face of a predator in the bushes, the rhythm of the seasons, was key to survival. We are wired to find order in chaos, to seek intention behind events. When we are confronted with a nearly perfect sphere, with precisely parallel grooves, that primal instinct kicks in. It is difficult for our brains to accept that such a sophisticated order could be the result of randomness and inanimate physical laws. We have a powerful bias towards seeing the hand of a creator, even when no hand was there. The second, and perhaps deeper, Reason is the allure of a lost past. The story that mainstream science tells of life's history, while grand, can feel lonely. It tells us that we, modern humans, are the sole peak of technological intelligence on this planet. It is a heavy responsibility and a daunting solitude. The hypothesis of an ancient civilization, in contrast, offers a far more romantic and compelling narrative. It whispers that we are not the first, that there were others before us, who may have reached heights we are only beginning to dream of. It transforms the history of Earth from a one-act play into an epic with many lost cantos. The Klerksdorp Spheres become the ticket that allows us to believe in that story. A physical proof that the past was grander and more mysterious than we ever thought. Finally, this story endures because it taps into an inherent skepticism of authority. When Michael Cremo speaks of forbidden archaeology, he is not just talking about stones. He is talking about the idea that a truth has been hidden from the public by an intellectual elite. This is a powerful and popular narrative archetype in our culture. To believe that these spheres are artificial is not just an archaeological belief. It is an act of intellectual rebellion, a way of saying, I do not trust the official story. I will find the truth for myself. Let us return to the final scene. In a dusty glass case in a small South African museum, or perhaps just in a picture on your computer screen, a Klerksdorp sphere rests, silent. It is no longer a simple object. It has become a crossroads of perception. To a geologist, it is a poem written in minerals and time, a beautiful testament to the slow, patient creativity of our planet. Each groove is a line of verse about a layer of sediment, each curve a stanza about pressure and heat. To a seeker of mysteries, it is a message in a bottle, cast into the ocean of time 3 billion years ago. It is a sacred relic, a whisper of sunken cities, lost technologies, and a history waiting to be rewritten. And to us, the observers, it is a precious reminder. It reminds us that the natural world is more complex and artistic than we often assume, capable of creating order so refined it can fool the sharpest eyes. And it also reminds us that the human yearning for meaning, for a grand past, and for hidden secrets is a powerful force, capable of shaping how we see reality itself. The true story of the Klerksdorp Spheres, perhaps, lies neither in their chemical composition nor in the legends surrounding them. It lies in that very ambiguity, in the twilight space between what we know and what we want to believe. It is not an answer, but an eternal question, posed in stone. And perhaps keeping that question alive is more important than any single answer. Thank you for taking the time to listen and to watch today's story. And of course, as always, a massive thank you. Thank you to everyone who supports the Science Stories channel. Whether you just watch the videos, leave a comment with your own theory, or share this story with others, I truly appreciate that contribution. The world is full of mysteries, waiting to be explored. Always keep an open mind and never stop questioning. I wish you all the best, and I'll see you in the next episode.